On a mid-July night in the year 64 AD, the air in Rome carried a weight that was more than just the summer heat. The city was a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of stone and wood, housing nearly 1 million souls within its cramped districts. It was the heart of an empire that stretched to the ends of the known world, yet it was also a tinderbox. In the narrow alleys near the Circus Maximus, where vendors sold flammable oils and textiles, a single spark escaped. It was a small beginning for a catastrophe that would rewrite the history of Western civilization. Within hours, the risk that had always lived in the shadows of the city's architecture became a terrifying reality. This was not just a fire, it was the start of a conflict between a ruler's private ambition and the survival of his people, a moment where the social contract was put to the ultimate test of heat and ash. To understand the shadow that fell over Rome that night, one must look back a decade to the ascension of a 17-year-old boy named Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He did not come to the throne through a peaceful transition of power, but through a web of intrigue, poison, and the ruthless ambition of his mother, Agrippina the Younger. From the beginning, the pressure of the empire was placed upon shoulders that had not yet hardened. Nero was a young man who saw himself as a poet, a musician, and a visionary, caught in a political structure that demanded he be a soldier and a statesman. In the early years, his reign was guided by the philosophers Seneca and the prefect Burrus, creating a facade of a new golden age. Yet, beneath the surface, a volatile tension was growing. The young emperor felt stifled by the rigid traditions of the Senate and the overbearing influence of his mother, leading to a psychological isolation that would eventually distort his perception of the world he governed. As the years progressed, the conflict within the palace intensified. Nero's desire for artistic expression began to clash with the physical reality of the city. He viewed Rome not as a historic capital to be preserved, but as an outdated, cramped obstacle to his own greatness. He dreamed of a city rebuilt in his own image, Neropolis, a place of wide boulevards, marble facades, and open spaces that would reflect the majesty of his reign. However, the sheer permanence of the old Roman districts, held by ancient families and protected by tradition, stood in his way. The friction between the city that existed and the city he imagined became an unbearable weight. It is during these years that the whispers of madness began, fueled by the erratic nature of his decrees and his growing distance from the everyday struggles of the Roman citizenry. When the fire broke out on the night of July 18th, the conditions were perfect for disaster. A strong wind blew from the south, carrying the embers from the shops near the Great Circus up toward the Palatine Hill. Historical records suggest that the blaze lasted for 6 days, subsided, and then reignited for another 3, eventually leaving 10 of Rome's 14 districts in various states of ruin. 3 districts were leveled to the ground. The accounts of the survivors speak of a confusion so deep that many didn't even try to fight the spread. They stood paralyzed as their history, their family shrines, and their security were erased by a force that seemed almost sentient in its path of destruction. The risk of living in the world's greatest city had turned into a nightmare of heat and falling stone. During the initial hours of the crisis, Nero was not in the city. He was at his villa in Antium, several miles away. When the news reached him, he returned to the capital, but his actions upon arrival remain a subject of intense historical debate. While some sources suggest he organized relief efforts and opened his private gardens to the homeless, a more persistent and haunting image emerged from the smoke. It is said that as the flames licked the sky, Nero ascended the Tower of Maecenas. Dressed in theatrical robes and clutching a lyre, he reportedly sang the Sack of Ilium, drawing a parallel between the fall of Troy and the destruction of his own capital. For many, this was the moment the line between a leader and a spectator vanished. The tragedy of 1 million people had become a mere backdrop for a singular, unchallenged artistic performance. In the immediate aftermath, the smoke rising from the streets became the visual manifestation of a broken trust. The speed with which Nero began clearing the charred remains of the city for his own projects did little to quiet the rising tide of public resentment. The fire had conveniently cleared the exact areas he needed for his most ambitious project yet, the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. This was not a palace in the traditional sense, it was a sprawling landscape of luxury that covered nearly one-third of the city's central area. It featured a rotating dining room that mimicked the movement of the stars, a massive artificial lake, and a bronze colossus of Nero himself that stood over 100 feet tall. To the grieving citizens who had lost everything, the Golden House was a testament to isolation, a private world built directly on top of public suffering. The financial strain of the reconstruction and the opulence of the Golden House pushed the empire to the brink of collapse. The conflict was no longer just between political factions in the Senate, it was a struggle for the very soul of the empire. To redirect the anger of the masses, a new narrative was required. Nero needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the fire that many suspected he had started himself. He turned his attention to a small, misunderstood community living on the fringes of Roman society, the followers of a new Eastern sect known as the Christians. These outsiders, who practiced their rituals in secret and refused to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor, provided a convenient target for a redirected and desperate public fury. What followed was a descent into a darkness that would define the era's legacy. The gardens of the new palace became the setting for spectacles that prioritized cruelty as a form of entertainment. It is documented by chroniclers like Tacitus that during evening festivities, the walkways were illuminated by a much more unsettling source than oil lamps. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nero would take rhythmic walks through his private groves, often pausing to recite poetry or adjust the tuning of his lyre. Beside him, the paths were lit by living lights, members of the Christian sect who had been tied to stakes and set ablaze to serve as human lanterns. This juxtaposition of manicured beauty and horrific reality served as a reminder that absolute authority, when left without boundaries, views human life as nothing more than a resource to be consumed. This period of leadership was characterized by a deep, internal paranoia. The more Nero sought to project an image of perfection and divinity, the more he alienated the very people who kept the empire functioning. Trusted advisors like Seneca were forced into permanent silence or suicide, replaced by sycophants who only knew how to nod in agreement. The risk of being close to the center of power became greater than any potential reward. The emperor had surrounded himself with mirrors, losing the ability to see the reality of his crumbling authority. In the quiet corners of the city, the shadowed plans for his removal began to take shape, not as a sudden explosion of violence, but as a slow, methodical withdrawal of consent from the legions and the provinces. The psychological toll of this absolute power was reflected in the increasingly erratic nature of Nero's decrees. He began to demand that the Roman elite participate in his theatrical performances, locking the doors of the theaters for hours to ensure no one could leave while he sang. This was no longer about governance, it was about the total occupation of his subjects' lives and minds. The ruler had become the only character on a stage that encompassed the entire world, oblivious to the fact that the audience had stopped cheering and was now merely waiting for the curtain to fall. The tension between his perceived genius and his actual incompetence as a leader had reached a breaking point. As the external pressures from revolts in Gaul and Spain mounted, the internal stability of the palace dissolved. The very guards who had sworn to protect him began to melt away into the shadows of the city. By the year 68 AD, the man who once thought the world was his playground found himself declared a public enemy by the Senate. He fled to a suburban villa, accompanied by only a few loyal servants, as the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the night. The realization that even the most absolute power is ultimately a fragile illusion is a recurring theme in the history of such figures, and Nero's end was a quiet, desperate affair that stood in stark contrast to the loud, flamboyant life he had led. When we look back at the Great Fire of Rome and the reign that followed, we see a cautionary tale about the nature of unchecked ambition. The events of the mid-1st century serve as a permanent reminder that the health of a society depends on a shared sense of reality and a balance of power. When reality is dictated by the whims of a single individual, the results are often catastrophic. The orange glow on the horizon in 64 AD was more than just a fire, it was the spiritual consumption of the trust between a government and its people. The legacy of this time is not found in the ruins of the Golden House, most of which was stripped away and buried by the emperors who followed, but in the lessons learned about the fragility of the social contract. The story of the man who watched his city burn is a study of the human condition under the most extreme circumstances. It explores the depths of what can happen when the pursuit of a singular, aesthetic vision is allowed to override the collective well-being of a civilization. The risk of absolute authority is that it eventually consumes itself, leaving behind only the ash of what could have been. The memory of the torches in the garden remains a powerful symbol of how easily human dignity can be devalued when it serves a political or personal narrative.
Father, this bread is good.
It is a dark chapter that reminds us that progress is not measured by the height of monuments, but by the protection of those who live in their shadow. Reflecting on this era allows us to witness the subtle patterns of power that still resonate today. The redirection of blame, the elevation of the individual over the institution, and the use of spectacle to mask systemic failure are themes that are universal. By understanding the darkness of the past, we are better equipped to identify the risks in our own times, ensuring that the fires of ambition do not once again consume the foundations of our shared reality. The weight of history is heavy, but it is through carrying that weight that we find the strength to build a future where the sky remains blue and the air remains clear for all. In the end, history has a way of smoothing out the jagged edges of a life, but the central conflict of Nero's Rome remains clear. It was a struggle between the needs of the many and the desires of the one. The orange glow that once pulsed over the capital eventually faded, replaced by the dawn of a new era that sought to distance itself from the imperial madness. But the whispers of that night still echo against the stone walls of the ancient world, serving as a permanent light that guides us away from the same mistakes. The world is not a stage, and the people are not merely props in a play, they are the substance of the empire itself, and any leader who forgets this truth is destined to watch their own legacy turn to smoke.